Peter B. Collins News and Comments. Honoring veterans today, it's November 11th, 2020, and it's a Wednesday. Yesterday, I recorded the podcast a little earlier in the day and ducked out to attend a memorial service on the beach along the Pacific Ocean, honoring our friend Hillary Flynn, who died last week. And as I was driving over the hill to the beach, I had satellite radio on, and I was listening to the breaking news from Washington that kind of neutered some of the reporting and comment I gave you yesterday related to Trump's moves at the Pentagon. Monday, tweet firing Esper, who is was the Secretary of Defense. Mark Esper is his name, so that he can go back to Raytheon. And I wasn't shedding a tear about that. I was talking about how this suggests to me that Trump is not planning any big moves with the military in the 70 days remaining before he is given the hook. But the news broke about the sacking and packing of the Pentagon, packing it with Trump loyalists. And we'll get to that story here shortly. But more ominously, last night, someone who's one of my correspondents online shared with me a call to action coming from the Oath Keepers. That is a right-wing paramilitary group, urging me and every other male up to age 65. I guess then I'm just beyond their demographic group. But we are all supposed to descend on Washington this Saturday for the Million MAGA March to make America great again. And InfoWars, that's led by Alex Jones out of Texas, they are leading a car and truck caravan into Washington, D.C. It's called the Stop the Steal Caravan. And patriots from across the nation have been told to converge on Washington this Friday and Saturday. And I'm very concerned about this because this is an effort to set the stage for a right-wing armed insurrection in support of Trump's empty claims that he has earned a second term. Let me read from their statement here. Oath Keepers is sending some of our most experienced law enforcement officers and military combat veterans into D.C. to help keep patriots safe this Saturday. Yeah. Oath Keepers is linking up with the InfoWars Stop the Steal Caravan and the organizers of the Million MAGA event. We will do all we can to assist with volunteer security on the ground inside D.C. Oath Keepers will have some of our most skilled special warfare veterans standing by, armed, just outside D.C. as an emergency QRF. I guess that's Quick Response Force. These are military, what do we call that? Letters, the acronyms. As an emergency response in the event of a worst-case scenario in D.C. And they explain, such as a Benghazi-style assault on the White House by communist terrorists in conjunction with stand-down orders by traitor generals. Now, this is really dripping with fear-mongering and with a sense of kind of projected response to a perceived sense of victimhood. Now, I don't know which communist terrorists they're talking about. Trump loves to talk about Antifa as if they are organized to carry out, choreographed operations. Returning to the Oath Keeper statement here, our men will be standing by, awaiting the president's orders to call us up as the militia, which would override the District of Columbia's ridiculous anti-gun laws. They note that by federal statute, all Americans from age 17 to 45 are subject to being called up as the militia by the president and all military veterans are subject to being called up until age 65 because of our training and experience. It continues. We call on all of our law enforcement officers, military, fire, emergency services, search and rescue brothers and sisters nationwide to also volunteer, either for the inside D.C. security op or for the outside D.C. contingency QRF. You do not have to be an Oath Keepers member to volunteer, but you do need to be a trained professional. All military and law enforcement officer veterans are encouraged to volunteer, but we especially need combat arms veterans, SWAT, riot-trained law enforcement officers, blah, blah, blah. You must be cool and calm under pressure, disciplined, and a quiet professional. Note, it says, for the volunteer security op inside D.C. to protect rally attendees, we also invite the participation of other patriot groups, such as bikers. Yeah, the Hells Angels have always been real good at security, like at Altamont for the Rolling Stones concert. Such as bikers who are not prior service but who have training, backgrounds, or experience that give them a capacity to effectively deal with unlawful physical violence by leftist terrorists. Now, who is feeding these extreme projections? These are fantasies. These are constructed out of whole cloth. And it parallels what I've been talking about here, that right-wingers have been brainwashed to believe that anybody to the left of the right in this country is a dangerous libtard who has to be stamped out. So later in this statement that does go on and on, under the headline, All Patriots must march on D.C. now, they state, this election was stolen. This is a communist deep state coup, every bit as corrupt and illegitimate as what is done in third world banana republics. We must refuse to ever recognize this as a legitimate election, and refuse to recognize Biden as a legitimate winner, and refuse to ever recognize him as President of the United States. This election was stolen by corrupt, law-breaking Democrat partisans on the ground and by the manipulation of the CIA-created hammer and scorecard programs. Now, these are deep state plots that are even beyond my knowledge. And the election, there was a huge attempt to steal it by Republicans for Trump. They don't acknowledge that. They focus on these phony claims, and we'll debunk some here in a moment, of widespread voter fraud. And as I have argued for years on this podcast and on the radio shows I hosted before, voter fraud is almost non-existent, and the efforts to root it out are a smokescreen for election fraud, and that's rigging of elections by insiders. So then they have a list here of what Trump must do to defeat the deep state coup. He must refuse to concede no matter what he must not concede. This election was stolen by domestic enemies, period. Trump must refuse to recognize it as legitimate because it is not legitimate. Next, Trump must declassify all of the dirty secrets in the files of the CIA, NSA, FBI, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, on all of the compromised political, legal, academic, business, media, social elites, etc. He needs to order our special operation troops in SOCOM to take lead on securing all facilities where all the data is stored, and he must have SOCOM intelligence officers take the lead on following his orders to immediately declassify all of the files on compromised American elites so we can defeat the deep state. The dirty secrets, who is a pedophile, who has taken bribes from communist China and other foreign enemies, who is engaged in murder, etc., are the, and this is, there's typos here. It looks like they're trying to say the swamp water that the swamp creatures swim in. Now, that reference to pedophiles is a clear, coded message to QAnon. And I don't know what linkage there is between Oath Keepers and QAnon. QAnon is as murky as Antifa. Only they have a bigger web presence and a lot more people who follow their whatever it is. So this is something we have to take seriously. And I am deeply concerned that this will be the moment when Trump signals to the Proud Boys that they no longer need to stand by. And the Boogaloo Boys, who are not particularly loyal to Trump, but they're anti-government and they love a fight, they could show up, bring some mayhem. This then could create the scene if there are, non-Trump supporters who show up to counter-protest this scene. This could then become the pretext for a declaration of martial law and for emergency calls by Trump that really only resonate inside that orange head of his. But he is so narcissistic and so deeply sick that he believes the stuff that he believes. He is buoyed by these kinds of crowds. And I wouldn't be surprised if he shows up on the mall on Saturday to egg them on. So this is a highly fluid situation. And it occurs against the backdrop of the Republicans who are enabling Trump, coddling him, as we'll quote John Bolton here in a moment, saying, well, we can't afford to piss him off. We need him to win the Senate races in Georgia. And so, just let him work through this. But there could be a lot of bloodshed. There could be a deeper polarization than we even experience today. And Trump may ultimately concede and drift away from Washington. But he's laying the groundwork for ongoing political chaos. And maybe in his mind, this is payback for Russiagate. And I do understand, as a skeptic of the Russiagate narrative, that Trump believes that it was concocted and created in an effort to make him the victim that he so deeply believes he is. Many of his followers, there's a poll that says 70% of Republicans believe that this election is not fair. And so those people with a sense of being victims are going to nurse those perceived wounds for a long time. So, one of the false claims that has surfaced came from James O'Keefe, Project Veritas. O'Keefe is this Republican provocateur, gets money from wherever, and he shoots these hidden camera videos. He's no Alan Funt. It's not candid camera. No, it is creepy camera. And so he went to Erie, Pennsylvania, where he worked with a postal worker named Richard Hopkins. Hopkins signed an affidavit claiming that a supervisor at the Postal Service in Erie instructed staff to tamper with ballots by backdating the envelopes of ones that arrived late. And news media accounts indicate that he has recanted those allegations in an interview with the investigating team from the Inspector General of the Postal Service. But other accounts say that he is denying the recantation. Meantime, Republican operatives are rewarding him for this apparently false testimony by setting up a GoFundMe account that last time I checked had over $125,000 for the postal worker. Lindsey Graham, the highly revered chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, has held up this affidavit on video on TV saying, look, the election's rigged in Pennsylvania. They're backdating the date of arrival of ballots. And in a video posted to YouTube last night, Hopkins then said, I did not recant my statements. And the Trump campaign has gone to court to argue in federal court various claims, vague claims and unproven claims of voting irregularities. Well, irregularities don't mean anything unless you have a specific claim that can show that thousands of ballots were somehow manipulated. Even if this postal worker is not lying and didn't recant, the idea that Erie, Pennsylvania, provided enough purloined ballots to change the outcome in Pennsylvania has to be proven. And they're not offering much in the way of evidence. So in a Reuters poll this week, 79% of Americans believe that Biden won the election, including 60% of Republicans, and 72% said the loser of the election should concede. But the Politico and Morning Consult poll is the one that found that 70% of Republicans don't believe that the election was free and fair. And Fox News is like two different channels. During the day, their newswheel anchors refer to Biden as the president-elect, and they view the election as settled. But then you got your Tucker, you got your Laura Ingraham, you got your Sean Hannity. And they come on in the evening when more people are watching, and they sell the Trump lies. And so at some point, reality will have to catch up. But Trump is really good at creating his own false reality and has been successful in convincing at least his Twitter followers that what he says is true and you can't believe anybody else. And in the Washington Post today, Aaron Blake provides exchanges between Trump lawyers and the judges who are pretty brutal in rejecting these empty lawsuits. So here's one in Pennsylvania where a Trump lawyer strained to avoid acknowledging that people were in fact allowed to observe the vote counting process in Philly. And this is being presented as some huge scandalous departure. So Judge Paul Diamond was quizzing this lawyer, who then, instead of saying, well, yeah, there were some Trump observers in the room, he had this unusual construction. Trump, in fact, had a non-zero number of people in the room. So that's at least one, right? And the judge said, I'm sorry, then what's your problem? At one point, 12 Republican observers and 5 Democrats were watching the count. That's on Friday afternoon, according to a ballot counter who was working there. So Diamond then pressed the Trump campaign lawyer to be more explicit. I'm asking you, as a member of the bar of this court, are people representing the plaintiffs in the room? The lawyer said sheepishly, yep. By the end of the hearing, Diamond invoked his right to make sure that lawyers in his courtroom acted in good faith. So another Trump lawyer, Jonathan Goldstein, was also grilled by a Pennsylvania judge this week. Under questioning, he acknowledged that contrary to Trump's claims about rampant voter fraud, he was not alleging that the 592 ballots that he sought to disqualify from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, were somehow fraudulent. So the judge says in your petition, which is right before me, and I read it several times, you don't claim that any electors or the board of the county were guilty of fraud, correct? And he rambles through and doesn't answer the question, and the judge says, I understand. I'm asking you a specific question, and I'm looking for a specific answer. Are you claiming that there is any fraud in connection with these 592 disputed ballots? And the lawyer, to my knowledge, at present, no. Are you claiming that there is any undue or improper influence upon the elector with respect to these 592 ballots? To my knowledge, at present, no. So this is theater, pure and simple. And the judges are getting really fed up with it. And there are other cases that are similar in other venues across the country. And one judge in a case, this is Chatham County, Georgia. Judge James Bass dismissed the case in a one-sentence, 8-word ruling. I'm denying the request and dismissing the petition. He abruptly adjourned the hearing, then elaborated in a written opinion, saying the court finds there's no evidence that the ballots referenced in the petition were received after 7 p.m. on Election Day, thereby making these ballots invalid. So they're just throwing up all kinds of made-up arguments. The courts reject them, and Trump orders more false claims to be presented to more courts. It's not clear where this exercise ultimately leads. But more people on his side of the aisle are speaking up. Bill Cohen, a former Republican senator from Maine, has called Trump's behavior more akin to a dictatorship than a democracy. Republican Governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, quote, I'm dismayed to hear the baseless claims from the president, from his team, and from many other elected Republican officials in Washington. I can't think of a worse time to stall a transition than amid a deadly pandemic, he said. Meanwhile, Mike Pompeo, he's over there at the State Department. We'll get to his little performance. But Pompeo put the kibosh on a mission that was conducted in October by the guy who is now the acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller. Miller was dispatched to the Middle East to pursue a diplomatic idea, asking the nation of Qatar to devise plans to buy off or marginalize senior leaders of al-Shabaab. And follow these names, because Miller had obtained permission from Kash Patel, who yesterday was installed at the Pentagon. At the time, he was on Trump's National Security Council. So Patel, with the approval of the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, allowed Miller to go on this trip, and they didn't tell Mike Pompeo. So he apparently did reach some sort of understanding, flew back to Washington, and when Pompeo was informed, he went ballistic. So there is a level of disorganization, chaos is really, it's not disorganization, but chaos in this administration. And it's remarkable that in this current performance, they can all stay on script. So according to the New York Times, Miller returned from his trip with a proposal to schedule three-way talks with Qatar and Norway to flesh out the proposals. Then Pompeo found out, and he hit the roof and insisted that the State Department take over that little portfolio. So let's now turn to the Pentagon. Mark Esper was out. Miller goes in. Then they stack the place with a bunch of right-wing nuts, some of whom are so toxic that they were not confirmable by the Republican-controlled Senate, like Anthony Tata, retired Army Brigadier General, a novelist, and a Fox News commentator. He called Obama a terrorist leader, and he's taken control of the Pentagon's policy department after they pushed out the acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, James Anderson. And then Kash Patel, remember? I just talked about him from the Security Council. Well, he's a former congressional aide to Devin Nunes, the Republican from Fresno who chaired the Intelligence Committee in the House before the Democratic takeover and has been a major apologist for Trump. Another new Miller advisor is Douglas McGregor, retired Army colonel who was nominated over the summer but not confirmed as ambassador to Germany. Because McGregor, who is a pretty crude guy, has referred to immigrants to Europe as Muslim invaders, he's advocated shooting illegal immigrants at the U.S. border and promoted a range of white nationalist conspiracy theories. But he supports a fast withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that has surfaced in the speculation as one of the reasons that Trump is making these lame duck maneuvers at the Pentagon. And if that's all it's about, well, I'm okay with bringing the troops home from Afghanistan. I don't think it's the smoothest way to do it. But Trump's never been about smooth. And I would love to see us end our presence in Afghanistan as soon as possible. I don't think there is any benefit to be gained by lingering further. But we know that Mark Esper went public with his opposition to Trump's potential use of the Insurrection Act to put down the Black Lives Matter protests this summer in Washington. And could Trump be planning, together with the Oath Keepers that I opened with in the Million MAGA March, to create a fake domestic disturbance that he will claim requires the law and order of deploying the U.S. military on domestic soil? That would be a very dangerous and unprecedented maneuver. But Trump is desperate. He is a cornered raccoon. And he's going to just lash out with those sharp talons for as long as he can. And I don't like to traffic in a lot of rumors, but this one is worth reporting. That the FBI Director Christopher Wray and the CIA Director Gina Haspel appear to be next. Now, is this just Trump exacting retribution? Or is he removing people who stand in his way of what we would call a coup if it occurs anywhere else in the world? And over at The Intercept today, Lee Fung reports an additional shift at the Pentagon. The Deputy Chief of Staff to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Mark Toome, was ousted from his position. And I do not have a named replacement yet. So this suggests that Trump is looking for some way to continue his grip on power. The law, the Constitution, history, precedent be damned. And so I do not want to be excessively alarmist, but I also don't want to pretend that this is not deeply alarming. And his intentions are not clear. Do his enablers, does Mitch McConnell know what the president is intending to do? Is he part of such a cabal? Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, all of these other lackeys of Trump, are they simply operating under the ongoing intimidation they feel, captive to their cult leader? Or is it something more? So I'm no fan of John Bolton, the mustachioed creep who could have been central to a successful impeachment of Trump. Not necessarily removal, but a much stronger case about Ukraine. And he clearly is settling his own scores with Trump. Op-ed, Washington Post, quote, as of this writing, The Republican Party has not suffered permanent damage to its integrity and reputation because of Trump's post-election rampaging. This will not be true much longer. It is simply a truism that Trump has a legal right to pursue all appropriate election law remedies to ensure an accurate, lawful vote count. To be credible, however, any aggrieved candidate must at some point produce valid legal arguments and persuasive evidence. Trump has so far failed to do so, and there is no indication he can. If he can't, his right to contest the election is beside the point. The real issue is the grievous harm he is causing to public trust in America's constitutional system. Trump's time is running out, even as his rhetoric continues escalating. And time is running out for Republicans who hope to maintain the party's credibility, starting with the 2 Georgia Senate runoffs in January. Here is the cold political reality. Trump is enhancing his own brand, in his mind, while harming the Republican brand. Now notice that Mr. Bolton leads with a partisan argument. He's only trying to persuade Republicans here. He's not trying to protect the nation from the dangers posed by Trump's denial and the support of so many prominent Republicans. Next paragraph. He disses Trump, saying that his goal is simple and straightforward. It's about himself. Then he says, the long-term Republican interest emphatically involves winning those Senate seats, but it also involves rejecting Trump's personalized, erratic, uncivil, unpresidential, and ultimately less than effective politics and governance. And Mr. Mustache continues, one approach holds that coddling Trump while he trashes the U.S. electoral system will help him get over the loss, thereby making it easier to reconcile him to leaving. But this coddling strategy is exactly backward. The more Republican leaders kowtow, the more Trump believes he is still in control, and the less likely he will do what normal presidents do, make a gracious concession speech, fully cooperate with the president-elect, and validate the election process by joining his successor at the inauguration. Coddling proponents plead that an enraged Trump will jeopardize the chances of victory in Georgia. But that is true only if party leaders do not speak up, explaining to voters what the real facts are. Do we in the GOP not trust our own base enough to absorb the truth? Well, I could answer that question for you, Johnny. One more quote. Republican passivity risks additional negative consequences for the country. Trump is engaging in what could well be a systematic purge of his own administration, starting with the utterly unjustified firing of Esper this week and continuing through high and mid-level civilian offices at the Pentagon. And over at the New York Times, Peter Baker and Laura Jakes say that Trump is doing something unusual. He is using elements of the U.S. government to fight the election results in an election that he lost. And this is where we bring on the antics of Mike Pompeo, who tweaked libtards like me yesterday by saying there will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. And they all recite the same thing, count all the legal votes, discard all the illegal votes, and this is a preliminary result. Let's see who wins. But it's not preliminary. It's very clear that Biden has won the Electoral College, and Trump has not. Trump remains mired at 214 Electoral College votes, with just Georgia and North Carolina really left to call. He's got North Carolina wrapped up, and we'll get to Georgia in a moment, but it seems beyond his reach. And the Times piece notes, throughout his presidency, Trump has tried to condition much of the American public not to believe anyone other than him with evident success. And they cite the poll I told you about earlier, 70% of Republicans don't believe the election was free and fair. So, at the State Department yesterday, Pompeo insisted that American efforts to prevent voter intimidation and ensure free and fair elections around the world were not diminished by Trump's refusal to concede. We must count every legal vote. We must make sure that any vote that wasn't lawful ought not be counted. He snapped when asked if Trump's delaying tactics undermine the State Department's efforts to pressure political leaders abroad to accept losing results. That's ridiculous, and you know it's ridiculous, and you asked it because it's ridiculous, he said. Well, no, it's not. You're ridiculous, and that is a cheap way of using offense as the best defense. So at The Guardian, opinion writer Jill Filipovic, I think, gets it right. She says the Republican Party has spent 4 years enabling Trump, backing up his lies, defending his most egregious misbehaviors, shattering longtime Democratic norms to keep his, and by extension their, iron grip on power. But by refusing to push him to concede an election he's clearly lost, they're truly following him off a cliff and threatening to take America with them. The president is mounting what in any developing country would be called an attempted coup. He's spreading outright lies about America's system of free and fair elections, claiming he won when he didn't. His sycophantic legal team is pulling issues out of thin air to undermine the American system of voting. He is wielding his power to try to install himself as an unelected leader, and Republicans are letting him. They all use the term preliminary election results. This isn't about letting the president have his temper tantrum, or as one GOP official put it, humoring him for a bit. This is about whether Americans can trust in our system and whether Americans will trust in our system. What Trump and his Republican enablers are doing, she says, is a wholly different thing. They aren't saying that the system is unfair because it excludes some people who deserve to be a part of it. They aren't saying that they lost because the rules were unfair. They're saying that one side cheated, that the system is rigged. And as I argue, they know that because they attempted to do the rigging. Now we drop by the air quotes Justice Department, where Bill Barr runs the legal operation to support Trump and occasionally do the business of the American people. And I meant to report this yesterday, and somehow it got lost in my papers. But a protege of Karl Rove named Richard Pilger resigned as director of the Elections Crimes Branch in the Justice Department after Bill Barr issued a memo which relaxes the standards, waters down the policies related to investigations of what is called massive fraud in last week's election. And as I air this out with you, I want you to consider there's a possibility here that Bill Barr is playing a double game, that he's written this memo, he's taking a lot of backlash for it, because he is largely changing a long-standing policy that federal investigations of election issues only take place well after the election, so as not to interfere. And Barr is stretching that, saying, well, you know, we really need to get on this before the results are certified because it might change the outcome. So in his memo, he wrote, I authorize you to pursue substantial allegations of voting and vote tabulation irregularities prior to the certification of elections in your jurisdictions in certain cases. While serious allegations of voter fraud should be handled with great care, specious, speculative, fanciful, or far-fetched claims should not be a basis for initiating federal inquiries. And it's that language that leads me to believe that Barr is playing a double game. Because Trump doesn't read the details. He doesn't have the attention span for somebody to tell him. And so Trump reads a headline, Bill Barr tells his people, take the gloves off, investigate irregularities, massive fraud. And then in the fine print, Barr lets his Justice Department employees off the hook by saying, well, if it's specious, you don't have to do it. So I may be too clever in my interpretation. But knowing how Bill Barr operates, I think this could be his way of pretending to carry out the president's order while sandbagging it at the same time. And I may be too Pollyannish here because Bill Barr is a dirty dog. He performs dirty deeds dirt cheap. But he may know the jig is up. And that he just has to make it through until January, when he can resign. And Trump will take the bulk of the disgrace. And Bill Barr will recede into a corporate law firm and make more money until he croaks. So I am openly speculating here. And it's very hard to give Bill Barr the benefit of any doubt. We shall see how it all plays out. So Georgia, the embattled Secretary of State, Republican Brad Raffensperger, or Raffensperger, as our friend Greg Palast likes to refer to him. Old Brad, he can't hardly dance, but boy, he is dancing as much as he can right now. He's under pressure from Trump, from Brian Kemp, the Republican governor of Georgia, from the two GOP candidates that are in the January 5th Senate runoff. So he announced that there will be a hand audit of the entire presidential vote across the Peach State, where Biden currently leads by 14,000 votes. There are about 5 million ballots, and they're going to manually verify each one by hand. And their target date is to complete it by November 20th, the deadline for the state to certify its results. Now, this could be an opportunity for misadventure. We do have to be vigilant in Georgia, where elections have been rigged and voters have been purged for a long time now. But Raffensperger is trying to straddle between the pressure from the Republicans and the focus on transparency or lack thereof in this recount. Now, historically, recounts have never shifted the result by more than a few hundred votes, even in a race with 5 million ballots. But there is an opportunity here to find some new ballots, to lose a few ballots, and with a margin of 14,000, we must be highly vigilant. And it's becoming more clear that those Senate candidates, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, the appointed incumbent, they are straddling as well. And they came out and urged that Raffensperger resign because this election has been such a mess. Well, it's only a mess because Trump didn't win the way he expected after all that pre-election chicanery that they figured would be enough to get Trump over the finish line in Georgia. And so as you look at Perdue and Loeffler, especially Loeffler, she had no hope of escaping this runoff. She was in a three-way race with Doug Collins and the Reverend, I'm sorry I don't have his name in front of me. And so for her to suggest that her race was somehow tainted is just utter fantasy. And Perdue is a weak candidate who is, he ducked the third debate with his opponent, John Ossoff, who flatly called him a crook. And John Thune of South Dakota, the second-ranking Republican in the Senate, he's the one who's explaining all this. We can't afford to piss off Trump right now because we want him helping in Georgia. We need his voters. And this shows just how deeply corrupt the Republicans are. That they would risk destroying so much in order to keep Trump happy or happy enough and to use him to get one last jolt of the Trump effect in an election that is crucial to both parties for control of the Senate. Every day I pause to acknowledge the people who've been supporting my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast, some of you for many years now, And I want to mention Joe Carson in Knoxville, Linda Lewis in Texas, who also contributes non-cash to our daily podcast, The COVID Report. Tom McAfee, a longtime friend here in Marin County, California, who has done a lot of work for me on video projects. Also Don Cisney, DGL. And I want to single out Lamara Williams-Jones, who sent me $25. Apparently, she's been freeloading for a while, and I don't object to anybody freeloading. It's not an issue for me. But she sent a final contribution and a very nice note, and I appreciate each and every one of you. And I want to reiterate that my current plan, unless there is a coup, in which case I will delay my retirement, but I'm planning to wind down the Daily News and Comment podcast before Thanksgiving. And then I have some final interviews that I'll be posting on into December, including some interviews with you, listeners, who I really respect and appreciate. And I just want to recap a few other things that on into the future, I'm going to be reposting some of my favorite past interviews, so just check in at peterbcollins.com occasionally. The archives and the website will remain up indefinitely. And as I've pointed out, if you've been a subscriber through the month of October, I already have your email. But if I don't, send me an email, and I'll put you on my alert list so that in the future, if I decide to break silence and do an occasional podcast, I hope to do that, then I will be able to alert you. And when you write me, please send me your tips for other podcasts or media outlets that you recommend. Many of my listeners are lamenting that they don't have or they don't know about other options. And so if you'd like to share, I would like you to share it, and we will pass that along to everybody. And one last note on this, please cancel your PayPal orders. I cannot cancel your subscription order at PayPal, and in order to keep you in my database here, I don't want to delete your subscription. So protect yourself and do cancel your PayPal payment orders to peterbcollins.com. Despite the hollowing out of the newspaper industry and the corporate media in general, the New York Times still has a lot of reporters, and they assigned them to contact the election officials in all 50 states and ask a simple question. Have you found any evidence of significant voter fraud? And the answer is 0, zip, Z. Trump is punching down on a Republican election commissioner in Philadelphia. His name is Al Schmidt. Trump tweeted today, a guy named Al Schmidt, a Philadelphia commissioner and so-called Republican, parentheses Rhino, that's Republican in name only, is being used big time by fake news media to explain how honest things were with respect to the election in Philadelphia. He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption and dishonesty. We win, Trump says with an exclamation point. Well, Al Schmidt was part of a package on 60 Minutes this past Sunday. And he's willing to say, even as a partisan, that there is no evidence of the widespread fraud that Trump has claimed exists. So it shows that Trump is attacking his own messengers without producing any of the evidence that would be required to mount any kind of a convincing case. And here's an outlier. A guy who is a state representative in Mississippi. His name is Price Wallace, a Republican. After he heard that the election was called for Biden on Saturday, he went on Twitter to say that Mississippi should succeed from the rest of the U.S. and form its own country. He's just tired of all that winning, and now he wants to succeed. And you just knock yourself out, dude. Please. Now, this will not be helpful, and I expect this to be all over Fox News and the Trump allies in the next 20 minutes. Now, I want to stress before I explain this story that it does not appear to impact the presidential election in any way, shape, or form. But in Puerto Rico, nearly 200 boxes of uncounted votes have surfaced a full week after the election, and it relates to elections for governor, legislators, and mayors across the island. Now, the discovery of these uncounted ballots could have sweeping effects. There is, for example, the mayor of San Juan race is separated by just a few votes. Also, in the city of Culebra, the mayor's race has a margin of just 2 votes, and in Guanica, it is a margin of 9 votes. And they're still trying to figure out how these boxes with as many as 4,000 ballots were misplaced. In the newly discovered boxes, many uncounted ballots from different precincts were found mixed together in the wrong place, badly organized. He stressed that none of them had left the elections vault, and their discovery underscored the transparency of the process. Well, we'll see about that. I want to recommend a piece at Mint Press News today under the byline of Raul Diego. He explains that when YouTube shut down many popular QAnon channels in mid-October, it led to a class action lawsuit against YouTube filed here in the Northern California Federal District Court. A total of 8 QAnon YouTube stars and 7 more unnamed plaintiffs brought a suit against Google and its subsidiary YouTube on October 26, alleging a violation of their constitutional right to free speech. And let me clue you that on YouTube, on Facebook, these are privately owned platforms. You do not have a First Amendment right. I'm sorry. It's just a fact. Among those named in the complaint are Polly St. George, who has a considerable following of Q fanatics, and Dave Hayes, who is also known as Praying Medic, that's Prey, is one of QAnon's more popular Q drops, an interpreter who explains what Q doesn't say. So the judge initially dismissed the claims and then reinstated part of them to allow the QAnon stars to pursue claims at a later time. So no injunction will be issued, but the matters raised in the case apparently will be part of a hearing, if not ultimately a trial. And I do think this is an interesting case because it was such a kind of class punishment. And I understand that it's hard for these big platforms to really analyze every post, every video that goes up, and then make intelligent and informed claims or calls about what is, what meets their standards and what doesn't. Twitter is not a part of this case, but their failure to really, evenly impose and enforce their terms of service is a very serious issue, in my opinion. So I welcome the lawsuit, and we'll see where it goes. Here is today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. The U.S. confirmed case count is now up to 10.2 million, and the death count is approaching 240,000. And meanwhile, COVID-19 hospitalizations in the U.S. hit an all-time high yesterday at almost 62,000, and new daily cases passed 139,000 for the first time. The number of people hospitalized has more than doubled since September and now exceeds the peak reached early in the pandemic when 59,000 hospitalized patients were reported back on April 15th. So we truly are in a second wave. And as I mentioned, the case count passed 10 million known cases. We're averaging more than 111,000 new cases a day, and the 139 or 140,000 number is the highest so far in the pandemic. And we've been surpassing 100,000 cases every day for a week. The 7-day average is at 123,000. More than 1,440 deaths were reported yesterday, pushing that 7-day average to more than 1,000 new deaths per day for the first time since mid-August. And a shortage of nurses and other personnel is limiting the ability to add more hospital beds to care for them. Standards are being loosened. We reported yesterday North Dakota is allowing asymptomatic healthcare workers who have tested positive to continue to treat patients. That is a recipe for disaster. The critical staff shortage, especially in western states, is causing growing alarm and driving some locations to take extraordinary measures. All but 8 states are now in the red zone for COVID-19 cases, according to the White House Coronavirus Task Force report that is not issued to the public. No, it came through a third-party group, the Center for Public Integrity. The Dakotas and Wisconsin again this week led the nation in cases per capita, and Iowa is coming in a close fourth. The task force writes, there is continued accelerating community spread across the top half of the country, where temperatures have cooled and Americans have moved indoors. Also shown is continued significant deterioration in the Sun Belt as mitigation efforts were decreased over the past 6 weeks, leading to the most diffuse spread experienced to date. The task force also issued its strongest endorsement yet of widespread regular testing for the general population. All red and orange counties must begin proactive testing of 18 to 40-year-old community members, according to the White House paper, and those instructions were aimed at New Mexico. Requiring use only in symptomatic individuals is preventing adequate testing and control of the pandemic. 20 states are now in the White House's red zone for percentage of positive tests, meaning that more than 10% of tests are coming back positive. 27 are in the red zone for deaths, meaning that they are having more than 2 deaths per 100,000 residents in the past week. And we know the White House task force is in disarray, and Trump and Pence, who's nominally in charge of it, just appear to be totally missing in action. And here's a report from Stat News. More than a dozen states have seen record-high COVID-19 infections over the past 5 days, but public health experts around the country told Stat that they're deeply worried that there hasn't been a correspondingly urgent response from federal, state, and local leaders. It is amazing how they can turn a blind eye and just treat this as the new normal. COVID's around, people are getting sick, some people are dying, and life goes on. Some governors and other elected officials say the public is tired of burdensome interventions. Leaders also feel burned by the backlash to more intensive measures, or they believe the virus will spread no matter what, so restrictions that harm the economy aren't worth the cost. The result, according to experts, is a dangerous combination of fatigue, fatalism, and forfeiture that will only result in more illnesses, hospitalizations, and deaths. Experts worry that simply relying on people to do the right thing might not be enough. Even people who've done their best to comply are slipping a bit and doing certain activities. And let me acknowledge, yesterday I thought twice about whether I should go to the memorial service for my friend Hillary Flynn. And they chose a location that's outdoors. We were on the beach right next to the ocean. People did keep their distances. Everybody was wearing a mask. Nobody passed around like food from a buffet. But inevitably, I was on the receiving end of a couple of hugs. And it just, makes you wonder, is this the moment when I have let my guard down? I certainly hope not, but I just want to be honest that we all make those risk and reward decisions, and that some people are much riskier in their behavior than others. One of the COVID-related stories that is sweeping the globe right now relates to transmission to animals and the mink population. Mink are now farmed in Denmark and a handful of other places. And the Danish Prime Minister last week said that all the country's mink would be culled. And that's a polite way of saying they would be euthanized due to fears that the mutation moving from mink to humans could jeopardize future vaccines. But opposition to the plan swiftly emerged. Massive doubts over whether this cull is properly scientifically based have come to light. And this is a quote from the leader of Denmark's largest opposition party called Venstre. At the same time, the government is taking away the livelihood of a large number of people without actually having the legal rights to do so. And we also have mink farms in the state of Utah, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture is investigating at this point after announcing the first confirmed cases of COVID in mink at 2 farms in Utah. These are the first confirmed cases in mink in the United States. The affected farms also reported positive cases of COVID-19 in people who had had contact with the mink population. There's currently no evidence that animals, including mink, play a significant role in spreading the virus to humans. Based on the limited information available to date, the risk of animals spreading COVID to people is considered to be low. More studies are needed to understand how different species may be affected by the virus that causes COVID-19, and there are also different mutations of it that also have to be studied in this respect. And from CNN, people carried the coronavirus onto mink farms in the Netherlands, starting a viral back and forth that ended up with 68% of fur farm workers and their close associates infected. Officials say it's imperative that the fur trade not become a source of further spread of the virus into the human population. The virus carries a genetic signature that links it to a strain that rapidly spread across Europe and into the United States early in the pandemic, and it's suspected that it hit the farms in April. And this is a fascinating element. I still have not found a credible source of speculation on where this virus came from, whether it was a laboratory, a weapons laboratory, like Fort Detrick here in the United States, or that biological lab in Wuhan, China. But we know that the primary vectors into the United States were from Europe. That's why New York had the big impact in the spring, and California kept its curve fairly flattened. And as Trump, during the campaign, kept trying to say that his visionary order to block travel from China was such a, effective response, that's not really true. Because there were outbreaks related to the cruise ship here in San Francisco. One of the early outbreaks was at a home for seniors, a nursing home outside Seattle. And those probably did come from China. But the vast majority of infections in the United States came through Europe. And the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have updated their findings about face masks. They're saying that the masks benefit the people who wear them, along with the people who are in proximity to them. In a document that details scientific evidence supporting mask use, experimental and epidemiological data support community masking to reduce the spread. Individual benefit increases with increasing community mask use. Now, I know there are a lot of people, smart people, who not only think that masks are ineffective in protecting the wearer or the people across the room from him or her, but they also believe that wearing a mask constricts the amount of oxygen you get and can cause you to get infected with COVID or other viruses. And at this point, I'm siding with the experts here. I think that wearing a mask makes sense. And I don't have a better option to offer in a way that reminds people that we need to be cautious, we need to wash our hands, we need to reduce the transmission of this virus as much as humanly possible. A couple of more items in the COVID file. Minnesota's Governor Tim Walz said he wishes that the Dakotas, his neighbors, would take more aggressive steps to slow the spread of the virus, and singled out South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem. Noem has been a real trumper and has refused to, despite being number 1 or number 2 in the COVID infections in the last month or so, just declined to do anything meaningful to try to regulate people's behavior and the spread of the illness. So the Minnesota Governor Walz lamented that Minnesota's catching up with the Dakotas, which are smaller in population but lead the country in cases per capita. Walt said he's not blaming neighboring states for that, but he said this summer's Sturgis motorcycle rally in South Dakota was absolutely unnecessary, and data shows that it helped spread the virus well beyond South Dakota. And singling out Noem, who is a Republican, he said he wishes the state would have canceled the rally and imposed a mask mandate alongside Minnesota. Now, the other day, Monday, the stock market jumped up and people were so excited because Pfizer announced that 94 people have had a great result from a test vaccine that Pfizer has been developing. And as you know, I don't want to speak negatively unnecessarily because, I'm in favor of anything that advances public health and snuffs out COVID. But get this. The CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla, on Monday sold 132,000 shares of his Pfizer stock at just about $42 a share. And that's $5.6 million. Now, he knew that news was going to be released. Yet a mouthpiece for Pfizer says, oh, no, he did not initiate that. It was done by an automated system. He set the price point back in August. Well, whether it was automated or not, Dr. Bourla is a profiteer from COVID. And I think that's pretty disgusting. I've linked to a commentary from Miko Peled. He is the anti-Zionist Israeli whose father was a general. He's been on our podcast and at MidPress News. He says that, well, look, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are both self-declared Zionists. There's a history of total U.S. support for Israel. But he is hoping that because Biden wants the United States to rejoin the six-nation deal with Iran called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that this is going to force Israel to adapt to a new administration. Now, I don't expect Biden to cut off the massive payments we give Israel every year. I don't expect him to stand firm against settlement expansion in the West Bank. But there may be some lines that Biden will draw. And, of course, one of the things, I should have mentioned this earlier, but it is speculated that the shifts at the Pentagon relate to a plan for an attack on Iran to mollify Benjamin Netanyahu before Trump leaves office, if he agrees to leave office. So that certainly is one of the possibilities that we face at the moment. But Peled notes, hopefully, he said there are a few things the Biden team will be able to reverse, though not without serious objections from Israel. These include a return to funding the UN agency charged with caring for over 5 million Palestinian refugees, and Trump had cut off that funding. Also, the reopening of the Palestinian mission in Washington, D.C. is another act that Israel won't like, but one might expect will happen under a Biden administration. So these are not major moves. It will not shift the dynamic substantially, but it will send a clear signal to Israel that Biden is different from Trump. And I hope that those of us who remain active can pressure the Democrats and Biden to a much more balanced posture and support of the rights and aspirations of the Palestinian people. And here's another positive development in the transition effort toward a new Biden administration. And I'm going to decline to speculate on cabinet potentials for the most part, because Biden's not listening to me, and he's going to put a bunch of Democratic veterans from inside the Beltway into most of those jobs. And I don't support putting Republicans in, and he is likely to attempt that. But this positive news is that Biden is poised to embed action on climate change across all of the federal government, from the Departments of Agriculture to Treasury to State, expanding far beyond environmental agencies to speed U.S. efforts to mitigate global warming. One of his point people in the transition is Steph Feldman. He said from the very beginning of the campaign, Biden made it clear he sees this as an all-of-government agenda, domestic, economic, and foreign policy. From the beginning, when he talked about infrastructure, he talked about making sure that it built in climate change, that we're making our communities more resilient to the effects of climate change. And we're told that in these initial calls, congratulatory calls he's gotten from heads of state, including leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Ireland, that in each case he elevated the issue and referred to it as a climate crisis. Well, he's not a Green New Deal guy. That's too much for Joe Biden. But I do acknowledge that he has an awareness of the issue. I think he recognizes the crisis that we face. And so I'll offer that praise, because I don't often find much to praise Joe Biden for. And finally, just to break the standard that I said a moment ago, there is discussion that Bernie Sanders wants to become Labor Secretary and that Elizabeth Warren might be appointed to head the Treasury Department. And I understand how this works, both, especially Bernie. He is older and he could cap off his career by leaving the Senate and having an impact at the Department of Labor. And there's a lot I like about Elizabeth Warren, especially on economic issues. But in each case, a Republican governor would name their replacement. And with the Senate currently trending at 50 to 48, with the Georgia races yet to be settled, I think that's a price that is too high. Thanks for listening to my Daily News and Comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.